Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Man Buns and Jesus. My name is Pastor Ben Olschlager, coming to you live from the snowy Great White North that is Lake Orion, Michigan. Yes, Josh, we have snow and I enjoy it. Deal with it. Um,
Also, this isn't live. This is recorded.
well, yeah, but the majority of people listen to this within the week that it's recorded.
That still doesn't make it live. But okay.
We're still gonna have snow at the end of the week. Um, hopefully. With me as always, Pastor Josh Laborious of Edgewater Lutheran Church in Eastvale, California. And today we are looking again at the book of Exodus. And we're looking at the end of chapter 13 and at all of chapter 14, where, just to summarize, because it's kind of a big chunk this week, see some of the interesting ways that God leads his people. First and foremost, by sending those pillars of cloud and fire to lead them by day and night, respectively, and then to lead them through the waters of the Red Sea as a way to leave the land of Egypt. Um, God knows what he was doing, uh, but it was an interesting course to take, and he certainly led them in a unique and powerful way in that moment. And Josh, who do we have on with us to talk about the way that God leads his people in unique environments like these?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're kind of gonna focus on the leadership of God's people. So, um, one of the names that came to mind immediately for me was someone I respect a lot. He's had a lot of impact on my formation as a Christian and as a pastor. But I am just one of what I suspect is either hundreds or thousands of people who have been impacted by his ministry. This is my grandpa. I know him as grandpa. My son knows him as great grandpa. Well, as much as my son knows anyone by English words. Um, and on his email signature, I guess, the Reverend Dr. Gerhard Michael. So thank you so much for coming on with us, Grandpa.
Happy to be here.
And what I want to kind of kick off with you is can you tell us a little bit about the different leadership roles you held in your career? And then also which of all of those roles was your favorite one?
Oh, I don't know what to say, but I think it's interesting how the Lord does lead us. When I went to the seminary back in 1961, the thing that happens, you get assigned to typically a church for field work. I don't know, how about you young men? Did that happen for you as well?
Yes,
Yep.
sir.
Well, guess where guess where I and five of my classmates were assigned? Not to a typical congregation, but to the All Nations. What did we call it anyway? All Nations. We were down at Pruitt-Igoe projects. There were 43 of these 11-story buildings downtown St. Louis. And the reason this mission got started there is because the pastor in the neighboring project, Transfiguration Lutheran Church, was Reverend Hartman. The police were at their wits' end. It had the highest crime rate in St. Louis. And he said, well, if you want to do something about it, you got to let me start a church in there. And so they were at their wits' end, and they allowed a church plant there, and they rented the community center in the middle of those 43 high-rise buildings uh, to use their facility from 8 in the morning till 1 o'clock for the grand cost of, I think it was $15 a Sunday. And we had room in the auditorium room for, we could have handled 800 people on chairs with a stage on one end. Now, we never had that many people, but the neat thing was on Thursday and Friday afternoons, there was a lady by the name of Mrs. Beck who had activities for the children, told Bible stories, and they did projects and the like. She had a volunteer staff that worked with her. And so we would have probably 40, 50, 60 children coming out to Sunday school and the like. We had a few Lutheran Lutheran high school teachers that also helped out. And we used to count how many adults from the community would we have in church? Probably maybe one or two. That's the way we started. But the next summer, there were three of my classmates that stayed. They couldn't live in those projects because you had to meet certain qualifications to do that. But they stayed off-site. But by living down there, they established some more relationships. And then we began to have apartment Bible studies. And that's where people came to faith. And then when they came to faith, then they started coming to worship. And we started having people being baptized, people being confirmed. And we would have adults in the congregation in the double figures, sometimes 12, 15, whatever. But that introduction to church life was way different than most of my classmates had. But that was very formative for me to what leadership is all about, where you listen to the community where you are. I can remember the man who was serving as our pastor was William Danker, who was professor of missions, and he had been the first missionary over in Japan. And he sent me out to make calls on some of the parents of the kids who were in Sunday school. And I went to the first apartment of one of the family. I said, this is stupid for me to go making calls Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, even though the kids had been sent to Sunday school. The parents were in no condition to welcome a visitor. And so I went to one of the storefronts just outside of the project, and the next thing you know, they were having me wrap up the children's message or the Sunday school class and making a presentation to them. Things are just different, and it's interesting. The challenge happened for me on my vicarage because I was sent to a suburban congregation in Baltimore that had been in the inner city, but when the inner city was changing, they left the inner city. And one of the books that I had been reading in my seminary, first 2 years of seminary, was The Suburban Captivity of the Churches, where the church that had fled from the inner city, and just come to realize that the church needs to be where the people are. Yes, it needs to be in the suburbs, but it also needs to stay in the changing city. The gospel is for everyone, and I think those early years in the seminary were very formative. And then my first call was to Japan as a missionary, and the first 2 years were language study. And what my wife and I did, we said, if we're going to really connect with the people in Japan, we need to learn their language so we can hear what they're saying and respond to them in their language. And so that's what we really focused on the first 2 years. And the crazy thing is how our experience shaped us. And you think of the Israelites there in Egypt, I can't help but think their experience of being enslaved at first, Joseph was the one who really was their benefactor, when he came in and said there's 7 years of plenty. We need to save up during these years of plenty so that when these 7 years of famine come, we're ready to handle that challenge. But after years elapsed, the next thing you know, the Israelites were enslaved. But if we are sensitive to our setting and our surroundings, that helps us respond so that we can lead in a way that people will respond and be blessed by it. But our experience was the English congregation just wasn't seeming to meet our needs while we were in language studies. So after about 6, 7 months, we went and visited all the Japanese congregations in Tokyo, and then we adopted one. So the second year of our language study, we were plugged into a little congregation called Ikegami Lutheran Church, and that helped us get ready for then we were sent up to the northern island of Hokkaido, and we served in the congregation of Takekawa. And it was interesting. Some Sundays, those first year, sometimes we only have 2, 3, 4 people and adults in the congregation. But by the time 3 years were up, we were nearly always in double figures. Sometimes we get up to 20 people in the congregation. And we did the same thing we did in the inner city of St. Louis. We ended up doing Bible studies in people's homes. People were curious about the faith. And here again, God was at work in that situation. What had happened the year before we arrived there, the previous missionary didn't have a single person show up for worship. But then he was taking the youth group to the missionary. They had 2 cottages on the Japan Sea for missionaries to get, rest and renewal, R&R. But he had taken a youth group over there, and one of the Japanese young kids, I suppose a high school student, went swimming in the Japan Sea where there was tremendous undertow. He got into trouble. The missionary sought to save him. The boy was saved, but the missionary lost his life. And that was just devastating, of course, to the missionary's family. But the Japanese could not get over that. Here's an outsider. The word for a foreigner in Japanese is gaijin. Gais is the picture is for outside. Jin is the picture for person. So a foreigner is an outside person. I mean, it's just obvious. It just, strikes you. But the fact that this missionary Darrell Quigley, had given his life attempting to save a Japanese boy, just made an impact on that community. And so when we came, they were served that during that interim year, no missionary was resident there. There were 2 what we called Prince of Peace volunteers teaching English as a second language in some of the businesses and colleges in that area. So there was that presence. And then another missionary served for 6 months, and a Japanese pastor served a little flock there for 6 months. But then when we came and were resident there was a welcome to us and openness, so that when we talked to people, they were very gracious and very welcoming. But it just strikes me that when you talk about leadership, it's the Lord provides the welcome. The Lord provides the anticipation, or what's ahead of you. And as you are open to that and respond to it, it's amazing how he blesses what you're seeking to do. And I think of where my wife and I said when we were in language study, we're going to immerse ourselves in that responsibility. We were doing a lot of other stuff. We immersed ourselves in learning the Japanese, and that helped us. Now, we weren't fluent or whatever, but there was if you can believe this, guess who was in that community? Not a Christian, but I would guess if this is a town of about 45,000 people. If there were a half a dozen people who could speak conversational English, That was probably the max. But one of them was someone who had read, are you listening? All the plays of Shakespeare in English.
That's some dedication.
That
I
is
have
just
not done that.
no, incredible. But he and I had a deal. We met every week and we studied Japanese for an hour, and then we studied the King James Bible because he wanted he wanted to know. And now for me, I wasn't reading King James Bible anymore. We were using the Revised Standard Version because it was so much easier for us to understand the English. But that's what our agreement was, that he would help me with my Japanese. I would help him with his King James Bible. So, but the Lord provided what shall I say, the resource for me to continue to grow in my understanding of the Japanese language. And I think that's what happens again and again. And the crazy thing was with us coming back to the States, they're having the president of the Japan Lutheran Church was Kosako Nao, and he was an expert in both English and Japanese. And he actually developed the Japanese Bible, the dictionary from the Hebrew into Japanese, and a very respected scholar. He wrote a letter of recommendation for me, and I also had a letter of recommendation from Professor Danker and then from David Schuler, who was the man who went from our seminary in St. Louis, and he was the associate director of the Association of American Theological Schools. And then I was admitted to Harvard and did a year there and got my Master of Theology in Comparative Religions, studying Japanese religions and history and background and so on, to go back to Japan. And what happens in the middle of the year I was there, but there were major budget cuts from our church body to the Japan Lutheran Church. So we didn't get back to Japan. But we ended up in a large congregation in Wisconsin. And there my vicarage congregation experience was helpful. And so was prepared for that. And that's just the way, I guess I would say, the Lord prepares us step by step for the challenges that are before us. And my experience in the inner city, my experience in Japan, I think really prepared us for the ministry in Warner Robins, Georgia, and then as district president. And today, I see our congregations, no matter where we are, they're in situations where we're on the mission front. Where I've served I'm out of, since June 4th, that's where I kind of formally retired from up in Dahlonega, Georgia. But that's a town, a lot of people have never heard of it. And I bet, Ben, have you ever heard of Dahlonega, Georgia?
Nope.
Dahlonega, Georgia is the first major gold rush town in this country. 1828, 21 years before California had their gold rush in 1849. And the gold on the Atlanta Capitol, that's Dahlonega gold, 97% good, pure gold. And
For anyone who's wondering, if you take 75 all the way through Georgia, like if you were going to Chattanooga or Nashville, you'll know you're around Dahlonega because there are, for whatever reason, just a ton of carpet and flooring stores. I can't explain it, but that's my memory of driving through Dahlonega is seeing all of these billboards for carpet and flooring. That for whatever reason, Dahlonega said we're going to sell
well,
all of the carpet and flooring in the world.
well, that's really Dalton, Dalton, Georgia. But Dahlonega is about 15 miles from the beginning of the Appalachian Trail, too. That's the another thing. And it's a home campus for the University of North Georgia. But you normally think of Appalachia as an old Bible Belt. The you do the what shall I say, surveys of people and so on. 75% of the people in Lumpkin County, which is where Dahlonega is, the county seat, 75% of the people have no affiliation, religious affiliation at all. That's mission field. And that's what our whole country is becoming. I don't know what it is out in California. I know that in the state of Oregon, one of my district president friends, that was 20%. That was all that was churched. And we have a mission field no matter where we're located. And one of the things that was disappointing to me when we were starting the call process to find a successor for me at Dahlonega St. Peter Lutheran Church, I called the Seminary of St. Louis. I said, this was a year ago. How many missionary pastors do you have, ready to be placed? He said one, and he's already slotted for a place in Colorado. And I asked the man at Fort Wayne. I knew these men from when I was district president, and he said, we have perhaps two. And I thought both seminaries had, I think, 31 or 32 graduates ready to be placed. And I said, to me, that's just sad. We need to have all 62 of the grads ready to be placed as missionary pastors, because no matter where we are, we're needing to reach out to people, because many times people aren't passing the faith on to the next generation, even their own kids. So, but anyway.
I'm just sitting here confused on how one, because we were at the SEM not too long ago. I don't know how you get a designation as a missionary. I thought that was the job for all of us.
All right, it is. That's the
Because they
point.
standardize the curriculum now. Everyone graduates with the same class load, whatever. Huh. I'm curious, but not curious enough to like call and ask.
I would guess it's probably the list of guys that have done something more mission related with their like vicarage, or because there was a guy that was a class ahead of us that did one of those 2-year international vicarages with a missionary in
Yeah.
Sri Lanka.
He's
You
out
get
here
like
these
one of
days.
those every couple of years, but I don't know otherwise what the designation would be.
Yeah, it's perhaps my raising the question of a missionary pastor not communicating what we're looking for.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, are you asking in this video that we're making what contributes to being a leader?
Well,
Or
I think
as
that's part of it, but I think also just with clearly all of your experience in leadership, some of the things that stand out to you, but what I hear as you've shared so much of your story with us, and obviously I have some background knowledge being the grandson, um, is when we look at this narrative in Exodus, when we see what God did for his people, um, both, and I see this in a couple of ways, because you see this blatantly obvious God is leading his people, where God has this pillar of fire, this pillar of cloud, and like if you see a pillar of fire that is big enough to lead an entire nation, that is pretty. You're like, that's something. That's, you don't see that every day. And then when the Red Sea splits, again, that's like a very obvious God leadership thing. But then you also see how Moses leads the people in what might be a less obviously God way. And I think what you drew out in what you shared about your experience in the inner city and your experience in Japan, and your experience moving back to the States and with the congregation there is how sometimes God was preparing you and preparing, um, I was about to say Joan, but that just feels wrong, preparing grandma for ministry and leadership in all these different places. Sometimes it's as obvious as a pillar of fire, but sometimes it's much more subtle, which I think is probably a good lesson for our listeners to take away, is that um, never discount what God is doing in your lives, because you never know what He's preparing you for down the line. Um, there are all sorts of instances where you might have a life experience where it doesn't seem like much, it doesn't seem like something that's really worth noting, but later down the line, it comes in really handy because you now have experience, or you have a skill set that allows you to step in and lead God's people in a particular way. Um,
Can
Ben,
I,
you look like something's marinating up there.
yeah, there is something marinating, and I'd like to throw a question back to you, Gerhard. So one of the chapters that we're looking at here is the crossing of the Red Sea, where the people of God show up to the edge of this, what would have been for them insurmountable body of water. There's no way you can swim across this. They don't have near enough boats. Um, like this is their demise unless God does something miraculous. Have you ever in your ministry led your people up to the edge of something that you were just like, I don't know how we're going to cross this? And then God showed you the way.
I I don't know if I would say that there's something I can point to, but it's it's interesting when you pose the question that way. You think of the being there at Harvard and taking these classes. I was, did a took the qualifying tests in terms like Japanese. They said, well, you can take whatever you want, and that's how good the Japanese had been. The preparation that I had in Japan, and I can remember the professor I had with I taking a reading course in social studies, and he said, where did you learn your Japanese?" That's what he asked me. But and you think, okay, we set a plan in place, you know, and this is what we were planning to do. But suddenly there's a roadblock, and you think, well, where are we going? And I know that it was interesting when that happened. The letter that came was, we're going to ask all the missionaries that are on furlough just to stay back in the States. We'll save the most money that way. And I said, that doesn't make sense, because missionaries were paid according to the years of experience you had. If you're going to save the most money, then you ask the people with a lot of experience to go back home and let the young guys keep on the payroll. And then they said, you're right. So, but that was the easy thing to do, is to ask all those who were on furlough and those going on furlough. But they 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 were not able to say, let's look at this in a what shall I say, a strategic point of view. The church body had just become a national entity where they were the uh, the national church body, that where the baton had been passed from the missionary group to the formation had been taking place over a few years, but I think it was like 1970 or 69 where it had been formalized that the Japan Lutheran Church was really the church in place over there. And so you accept that. And then when you roll with it, and it works out. And my name had not been circulated, for a call until I found out that was all this kind of unsettledness. It was kind of ambiguous through, I think, until the middle of May. And I finished my coursework and I had my, what shall I say, defense of my couple papers that I'd written about the Soka Gakkai beginning of June and had successfully defended that. And then I got a call. It happened just like that. So everything came together. So I don't know, Ben, if that's a response to, how things were unsettled. You faced a question of how it's going to work out, but it did. I know I had some classmates that aren't at Harvard. Aren't you going to stay and just keep working toward a PhD? No, that wasn't in the works. But I think what when you look back, you can see we can plan sometimes, and the Lord changes the plans, and He works it out. And sometimes you make decisions, you wrestle with it, and I think after you look back, you said, well, that's the way it was supposed to be. Like I had the appointment to be the director of missions back 1989. It just kind of came out of the blue. And I wrestled with that for about 6 weeks, but finally it didn't become convincing that I should take that call. So I turned it down and continued to serve there at Warner Robins. And then I wasn't looking to be district president, but I ended up getting elected and I felt, well, I need to take it. So
Now,
I don't know the answer to your question, Ben, but
I'm a little curious, and I don't know how much you can tell us because I don't know how many. I'm just going to ask a question and let you respond however you want. But can you tell us a little bit about your experience leading as a district president? And what does it look like to lead God's people kind of from, how shall we say, 1,000 feet up as compared to congregational leadership, which is right there on the ground?
well, what I think I sought to do on the district president level is in many ways what I sought to do on the congregational level. One of the things that I felt I wanted to do as a pastor was not just take care of the flock and feed them, with worship that has content and this is one of the things I think I just assimilated from my dad. He was someone who had content in his sermon, but there was law in the gospel. You sensed the need for the forgiveness and for the renewal and the strength. And then there was the proclamation of the word that you felt forgiven and renewed and strengthened. And the care of souls, visiting the sick and the shut-ins and encouragement. But I felt one of the things we needed to do was to teach our people so that they sensed God's plan of salvation and that He was enlisting us to be part of that plan and that He wanted to use us to serve and to witness and to pray and to be involved. And so on the congregational level, one of the things that I felt was important was really to implement the priesthood of all believers so that it wasn't just the pastor doing the ministry and people being consumers, they were being participants. And so on the district level, that was one of the things that I really sought to implement is how can we empower our pastors and DCEs and leaders to go ahead and implement the priest of all believers, and in turn reach out and become more missional and not just maintenance, keeping things going as they were. And so I think sometimes one of the things that we lack is a vision to look beyond just the immediate needs, and you look out 5 years down the road or whatever. And that, I think, sometimes is a gift that God's give to some people and not to others. And not everybody has that gift to be visionary, and to be forward looking. And when we're not forward looking, I think many times then we end up being fearful, and we turn in on ourselves and we're not visionary. And you think of the story of Israel. You know, they got through the Red Sea when Moses was up on the mountain too long. The next thing, they panicked and they got a hold of Aaron, and the next thing they're building a calf to worship. And you think you had the spies go and check out the land, and well, Caleb and Joshua said, we can take them. The Lord's with us. And yet the 10 prevailed. And what happens as a result of them prevailing? 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And it's just sad, when you think the vision was there, the Lord made us a promise, we could take the land. But because they didn't trust the promise, they ended up wandering for 40 years.
I would like to just interject, and this is totally unrelated to anything we've discussed in this podcast, but keeping in mind the spies of Israel, especially Caleb and Joshua, saying, we can take them. I contend that any trouble my brother Caleb and I get into together, being Caleb and Joshua, is kind of my parents' fault for naming us Caleb and Joshua. They literally asked for us to, have an attitude of, yeah, we can take them. We can go get them.
But the original Caleb and Joshua both said that faithfully.
Hey, we're in the ballpark, Ben.
And your name is Benjamin. You're one of the partners with Judah and the southern two tribes that hung in there 125 years longer than the northern tribes.
That's fair, but the tribe of Benjamin also had a lot of problems.
You don't have those. But what I think is really cool with that attitude, with the time you served as district president, is this idea of we're lifting up not just people necessarily that have whatever academic qualifications or certification, but we're lifting up people to serve in these different roles guided by this vision. And I think we can tie that back into our reading, because the reality is no matter what leadership roles we take, whether it's as pastors or as lay people or whoever you are, ultimately the one who is moving hearts and minds and who is acting is God. And when we look at it from that light, I think we can be emboldened in taking on those leadership roles wherever we're coming from, because we know that ultimately God is the one doing the work, which I think encourages us to say, yeah, we're going to lift up God's people, no matter where they're coming from, to these roles that God has been preparing them for the whole time.
I think
including a murderer to lead thousands of people, like Moses, right?
What was that?
What did you say?
Including lifting up a murderer like Moses to lead thousands of people.
Yeah.
yeah, maybe let God do that one, actually.
No, I think sometimes, we talk about faith, hope, and love. I think sometimes we minimize the power of hope. When you think of hope in the biblical sense, it's not, I hope it doesn't rain. Hope is really something that is going to happen. And guaranteed by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so we can be people who are buoyant in our hope. It's going to happen. And because of that, we can be people who, in the face of difficult situations and tough odds, we can face forward with hope. And I think that's something probably that we need to lift up more often than we maybe do, is the hope that we have because of what Christ has done and risen from the grave. And he's now on the throne, ruling over all things. And make our plans, but they're contingent plans, but his plans are permanent.
And if God can raise Jesus from the dead, who are we to tell him no?
Exactly. Yep.
So, Ben, if you're okay, I think that's actually an excellent note to start to transition toward closing on. Am I
Yep.
reading the room well?
Yep. Go ahead.
So, Grandpa, something we didn't warn you about, and don't feel bad because we never warn any of our guests about this, even though maybe we should, is we like to end every episode with takeaways. And how we kind of define that, how we approach that is, if you could impart one thing, so one sentence, one nugget of information or wisdom or application or whatever, if you could have the listeners stick one thing that stays in their brain after they're done listening to this, what would that one thing be? And if you have something ready to go and you want to share it, you can go first. Otherwise, I'll make Ben go first and give you time to think.
Let Ben go first.
Okay. So, Josh, I think my takeaway, this is a combination of what we see from Moses as God elevates him into leadership. Some of what your grandpa shared with us about him going from um, like going through seminary and going through his ministry and being elevated to circuit visitor, or not circuit visitor, district president, all of these things. And then to some extent, I know from each of our lives, like what it looked like to go from what we were doing in the ministry. Um, in each of those cases, there wasn't necessarily a strong drive from our own hearts to do ministry. For me, it was prodding from my grandmother. I know from you, it was a number of the voices around you during college that were like, yeah, math's cool, but like, go serve Jesus. Um,
Yeah,
Gerhard,
math's
I know
cool, I guess.
Gerhard, your district saw that you were a worthy leader, even if it wasn't something that you were seeking out yourself. And God, like I said, God chose a murderer in Moses to lead his people. He certainly wasn't looking to lead them at the time. And those are four examples of people that he has lifted up to be leaders uh, in his people and in his world. Um, and I think that's a good lesson for us is that if someone is seeking out roles of leadership, they may not be the one that God is really trying to push into those roles, but instead we should be looking for those people in our contexts, like you did, Gerhard, during your district president days, to elevate into roles where they can help uh, promote the things that God is already doing on earth and keep the ministry going. That's my takeaway. I know it was kind of long.
Well, I think even with Moses, when he was raised, guess where? In Pharaoh's house, right?
Yeah.
I think that was preparation for what God was going to have him do later on. And I think in many ways the Lord prepares us for the work that he's calling us to do. And to me, that's very, what shall I say, encouraging, empowering, that he prepares us for what he wants us to do so that we can lead with certainly with we want to lead with humility, but with confidence because of the hope we have in Christ. I think one of the hymns that your grandma, Joshua, has really embraced is Christ be my leader. And when we let him be our leader and Lord, it's amazing what we can undertake in his name and for his sake. And
I think to close us out with one last takeaway is just, I want to point everyone back to the place we came from in Exodus. The fact that there was these supernatural things happening as God led his people. And I mean, largely as God led his people through the ministry of Moses. And the reason I want to draw our attention to that is just as a reminder, you might not always feel equipped. Moses certainly didn't. But that doesn't mean that God isn't going to use you for whatever leadership role you are being pushed into or called into. So have confidence not in yourself, but have confidence in the God who promises to work through us. And with all those takeaways, this has been season 5, episode, I don't know, 6 or something of Man Buns and Jesus. We're glad that you joined in. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and like it. If you're on a platform that enables such things, go ahead and share it with a friend or a family member if you think it was worth sharing. Especially if you have a friend or family member who maybe is in or contemplating a leadership position where this might be a helpful conversation for them, go ahead and share it with them. Also, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast because it helps our egos, and sometimes we could use the boost, I guess. If you have ideas for an episode, or you have a topic or a host, a guest host that you'd like us to bring on, please just let us know. If you know us personally, you can shoot us a text or an email. If you don't know us personally, we have a Facebook page that gets checked occasionally that you can message and we will see it. Just know we are trying to work our way through Exodus. So unless we're really excited about your topic, it's going to have to wait until we're done with Exodus. And finally, I haven't been plugging this as much, but we do have t-shirts available. So if you want to buy a t-shirt with the silhouettes of our face on it, you can do that. And if you do that, please send me a picture of you wearing the t-shirt, because honestly, I think it's just going to be hilarious if anyone actually buys one of these t-shirts. So you can find those at edgewaterlutheran.org/gear. You probably have to scroll pretty far down the page because it's pretty much just a joke that this t-shirt even exists. But it would be an even funnier joke if someone actually purchased and wore said t-shirt. So with all of that, it has been a pleasure speaking with all of you, speaking to all of you. And brothers and sisters, go in peace and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.